220 feet beneath the surface of the Kattegat Strait, the ocean floor is composed of a fine glacial clay that behaves less like a solid surface and more like a high-viscosity hydraulic seal. This is the resting place of U-534, a Type 9 C-40 long-range submarine that has remained submerged for 48 years. To a naval engineer, this depth is technically modest, as the pressure hull was designed to withstand hydrostatic forces at more than twice this level. However, the physics of the seabed introduces a variable that naval architecture cannot account for with steel thickness alone. The submarine is not merely resting on the floor, it is anchored by a phenomenon known as soil adhesion or mud suction. This occurs when the heavy hull settles into the silt and displaces the water beneath it, creating a perfect vacuum seal between the steel and the seabed. To understand the scale of this engineering challenge, one must view the submarine as a massive piston inside a cylinder of wet clay. The surface area of the 252-foot hull creates a coefficient of friction and a vacuum force that can effectively double the calculated weight of the vessel during an initial lift. If a salvage team attempts a direct vertical pull, they are not just fighting the 1,200 tons of dead weight, they are fighting the entire atmospheric pressure of the water column pushing down on the clay. Without breaking the seal, the lifting cables would reach their elastic limit and snap before the hull moved a single inch. This vacuum is a silent antagonist that turns a standard recovery into a high-stakes experiment in hydraulic breakout force. The condition of U-534 is an anomaly in maritime forensics. When she was sent to the bottom on May 5, 1945 by an RAF Liberator from 547th Squadron, the hull did not implode. Usually a submarine that exceeds its structural limits will experience a catastrophic collapse of the pressure hull as air pockets are crushed by the deepening water. The fact that U-534 remains largely intact 16 miles northeast of the island of Anholt proves that the interior was flooded almost immediately. The hydrostatic equilibrium was achieved before the ship reached her crush depth. This preserved the internal geometry of the vessel, but it also meant that the salvage team would be lifting a ship filled with thousands of tons of seawater and dense silt. As the cameras of the first survey teams moved along the hull, they discovered a startling level of preservation. Through the green gloom of the Kattegat, the distinctive zinnia camouflage pattern was still visible on the steel plating. This intricate defensive paint scheme was designed to break up the silhouette of the boat against the surface of the sea, yet it had survived nearly 5 decades of immersion in a high-current environment. The presence of this camouflage suggests a unique chemical environment at the seabed, where the fine silt had shielded the paint from the abrasive effects of moving sand and oxygen-rich water. The ship was a time capsule of 1945 technology wrapped in a layer of protective mud and historical mystery. The central paradox of U-534 is that she is a wreck that should not exist. Most U-boats sunk in the final days of the war were either destroyed by internal scuttling charges or shattered by deep water implosions. This vessel sits at an angle of 45 degrees capsized and defiant in a major shipping lane. Her presence at 220 feet is a mechanical invitation to any engineer with the capital and the courage to challenge the suction of the Kattegat. The question for the salvage team in 1993 was not just whether the ship could be found, but whether the structural integrity of a 48-year-old hull could survive the massive torsion required to rip it free from the seafloor. The ocean had spent decades tightening its grip on the steel, and the breakout force required would push the limits of modern maritime technology. The salvage of a military vessel is typically the domain of sovereign states or massive insurance conglomerates. Yet the recovery of U-534 was initiated by a single private entrepreneur. Karsten Ree committed $12 million to a project that had no guaranteed return on investment and carried immense legal and environmental liabilities. This is the logical paradox of the operation. In naval salvage, the recovery of a combat vessel often involves ordnance clearance and war grave protocols. But in this instance, a private citizen was assuming the risks of a military operation. The cost was not just in currency, but in the potential for a catastrophic failure that could result in toxic contamination or the loss of the salvage platform itself. The primary technical anxiety centered on the 380 cells of the lead-acid batteries located beneath the deck plating. When a submarine is submerged for nearly half a century, the chemistry of its propulsion system remains a latent threat. These batteries utilize lead plates and sulfuric acid to store electrical energy. Over 48 years of immersion in salt water, the battery casings are subject to corrosion. If the internal pressure of the submarine decreases during the ascent, the batteries can undergo a process called outgassing. As the ambient pressure drops, the trapped hydrogen gas expands. If this hydrogen mixes with oxygen, it creates a highly explosive atmosphere within the cramped interior of the hull. Furthermore, if salt water enters the batteries, it can react with the acid to produce chlorine gas, which is lethal even in small concentrations. This chemical volatility meant that the $12 million hull was essentially a pressurized bomb moving through the water column. While the chemical risks were internal, the physical risks were dictated by the weight distribution of a capsized hull. The submarine was leaning at 45 degrees, which created an uneven load path for any lifting gear. In a standard upright lift, the center of gravity is aligned with the keel, allowing for a symmetrical distribution of stress. At a 45-degree angle, the salvage team had to account for the way the 1,100 tons of steel would shift as it was pulled free from the soil adhesion of the seabed. This callback to the suction of the Kattegat meant that the initial breakout would require a surge of force that could potentially rupture the pressure hull if the slings were not perfectly positioned. The center of gravity was no longer a static point, but a moving target that changed with every inch of the submarine movement. The inventory of the interior spaces revealed a strange mixture of wartime necessity and personal survival. Inside a crew locker, searchers found a cache of 2,000 condoms. In the context of a long-range Type 9 C-40 submarine, this was not an item of luxury, but a piece of standard equipment for a crew expected to be away from home ports for months at a time. It represents a fringe detail that humanizes the mechanical environment of the boat. These items, along with thousands of personal letters and supplies, were preserved by the lack of oxygen in the flooded compartments. The lack of interior current and the anaerobic conditions created by the silt had turned the submarine into a vacuum-sealed vault of 1945 daily life. The $12 million gamble was predicated on the belief that the hull could be raised without the outgassing of the batteries, triggering a secondary explosion. The engineers had to calculate the rate of ascent with surgical precision. If they pulled the ship up too fast, the internal gas expansion would exceed the structural limits of the corroded battery casings. If they moved too slowly, the weather windows of the Kattegat would close and trap the salvage platform in a dangerous storm surge. This was a battle between chemical kinetics and maritime engineering. Every foot of progress toward the surface was a foot closer to a potential atmospheric detonation. The project was moving forward without military funding or government oversight, but it was operating under the absolute laws of chemistry and hydrostatic pressure. At 220 feet down, the biological clock of a commercial diver is measured in minutes, while the physical labor required is measured in tons. For the salvage team working on U-534, the primary obstacle was not the depth itself, but the opacity of the environment. In the Kattegat, the silt and glacial clay are easily disturbed by the slightest motion of a swim fin or the exhaust of a regulator, turning the dive site into a cloud of liquid darkness. The divers were forced to operate almost entirely by touch, feeling the cold, curved steel of the pressure hull, while navigating currents that threatened to pull them away from the wreck. This was a high-stakes industrial environment where any error in orientation could lead to a diver being pinned beneath the 1,100-ton hull as it shifted in the soft sediment. To move the 3-inch steel cables beneath the submarine, the engineers utilized a technique known as jetting. This process involves the use of high-pressure water lances that behave like liquid drills. By injecting water at extreme velocities into the seabed, the divers were able to liquefy the glacial clay and carve 6 distinct tunnels directly beneath the keel. This was not a process of excavation in the traditional sense, but a method of hydraulic displacement. The divers had to lie prone on the seabed, pushing the lances deep into the mud while working blind. They were essentially carving a cradle out of the earth itself, 1 cubic inch at a time. This method was the only way to bypass the soil adhesion that had locked the submarine to the floor for 48 years. The geometry of the lift was complicated by the 45-degree list of the submarine. Because the boat was capsized to starboard, the 6 tunnels could not be symmetrical. Each tunnel had to be calculated to account for the uneven distribution of the hull against the clay. If a tunnel was too shallow, the lifting cable would put too much pressure on the thin outer casing of the submarine rather than the reinforced pressure hull. If it was too deep, the cable might slip during the initial pull. The divers threaded the massive cables through these 6 tunnels, creating a series of loops that would act as a structural harness. This was the moment where the mechanical logic of the salvage began to take shape as the engineers sought to turn the dead weight of the wreck into a manageable load. Amidst the industrial chaos of the tunneling, the divers found evidence of the final moments of the submarine. The schnorchel mast, which allowed the boat to run its diesel engines while submerged, was found in its fully retracted position. This is a critical forensic detail because it confirms that the boat was likely on the surface or in the process of diving when the RAF Liberator attacked. A retracted mast means the crew was not attempting a stealthy escape at periscope depth, but was caught in a moment of tactical vulnerability. This small piece of hardware, preserved by the same hydrostatic equilibrium that prevented the hull from imploding, provides a clear window into the timeline of the sinking. It is a reminder that every valve and mast on the ship is a frozen record of a decision made in 1945. With the 6 cables in place and the tunnels verified, the salvage shifted from the seabed to the surface. The harness was ready, but the engineers were still operating under a cloud of uncertainty. The cables were now threaded through 60 feet of clay, and the suction was still holding the submarine with a force that exceeded all standard calculations. The next phase would require a platform that could maintain a perfect vertical pull regardless of the tides and currents of the Kattegat. The transition from the blind manual labor of the divers to the satellite-guided precision of the lifting vessel was about to begin, and there was zero margin for error in the synchronization of the hydraulic jacks. 3 inches of woven high-strength steel. That is the diameter of the primary lifting cables tasked with arresting 48 years of inertia in the Kattegat. While 3 inches may sound substantial in an industrial context, it represents a dangerously narrow margin when applied to the breakout of 1,100 tons of dead weight. The cables must not only support the mass of the submarine, but also the kinetic energy of the water column and the stubborn grip of the glacial clay. This is a mathematical impossibility that can only be resolved through the application of a perfectly vertical and stabilized pull. Any lateral movement of the lifting platform would introduce a shear force that could snap the steel strands as if they were thread. To achieve this level of stability, the salvage team utilized the Smith Semi-1, a massive semi-submersible vessel that serves as a mobile offshore base. The platform is capable of holding its position in the open sea through a technology called dynamic positioning. This system replaces traditional anchors with a network of computer-controlled thrusters that respond in real time to environmental variables. Dynamic positioning integrates satellite data and acoustic sensors to maintain the coordinates of the vessel within a few centimeters of accuracy. In the context of the U-534 salvage, this was the only way to ensure that the 6 3-inch cables remained in a perfect vertical alignment. The ship essentially stays frozen in space while the ocean moves around it, allowing the hydraulic jacks to apply a uniform force to the 6 tunnels jetted beneath the hull. The precision of the lift was not just an engineering requirement, but a safety mandate. As the tension in the cables increased, the risk of structural failure grew exponentially. Inside the hull, the air pockets and flooded compartments were beginning to react to the change in pressure. This is where the risk of lead-acid outgassing became a primary concern. The volatile hydrogen gas trapped within the battery casings was subject to expansion as the submarine moved even a few inches upward. If the lift were to be jerky or uneven, the sudden shift in load could rupture the corroded internal bulkheads, releasing explosive gases or lethal chlorine. The dynamic positioning system provided the steady hand required to manage this chemical volatility during the most critical phase of the breakout. While the engineers monitored the cable tension, the forensic survey identified a specific hazard lurking in the forward torpedo room. 3 T-11 acoustic torpedoes were found still loaded in their tubes. These were among the most advanced weapons in the German arsenal in 1945, designed to track the sound of Allied screw propellers. The discovery of these live warheads meant that the salvage was now an unexploded ordnance mission. The T-11 torpedoes were particularly sensitive, and the mechanical stress of the lift could potentially trigger their firing mechanisms or deteriorate their explosive fillers. This added a layer of lethal complexity to the operation. The 547th Squadron had failed to detonate these weapons during the initial attack, but they remained fully functional after nearly half a century in the deep. The synchronization of the hydraulic jacks was the final piece of the mechanical puzzle. Each of the 6 cables was connected to a dedicated jack that could be adjusted independently. The engineers used sensors to monitor the load on each cable, ensuring that the capsized hull was lifted evenly. This prevents the torsion that would occur if one side of the 1,100-ton wreck were to break free from the mud before the other. The cables were now under thousands of pounds of tension, humming with the energy required to break the vacuum of the seabed. The Smith Semi-1 stood as a silent sentinel over the wreck, her thrusters fighting the current to maintain the perfect verticality that would allow U-534 to finally leave the Kattegat floor, August 23, 1993. The weather window in the Kattegat was rapidly contracting. In these northern waters, a sea state can transform from a manageable swell to a hazardous gale in less than 4 hours. The engineers aboard the Smith Semi-1 were operating with the knowledge that if the hull of U-534 did not break free from the seabed within this specific window, the entire operation would have to be abandoned. The tension in the 6 3-inch cables had already reached its calculated limit. On the monitors, the load sensors registered a force that exceeded 1,100 tons. This was the mathematical manifestation of soil adhesion. The ocean was not just holding the boat, it was refusing to let go of the vacuum seal it had perfected over 48 years. As the hydraulic jacks began their final synchronization, the team had to manage the complex physics of sling stress and the center of gravity. When a submarine is sitting at a 45-degree angle on the seabed, the weight is not distributed evenly across its structural frames. As the lift begins, the center of gravity shifts in a 3-dimensional arc. If one end of the submarine breaks free of the clay before the other, the resulting torsion could snap the longitudinal girders. This is known as a point load failure. The slings must be positioned so that they cradle the pressure hull without crushing the thinner external ballast tanks. The engineers used the dynamic positioning of the vessel to maintain the vertical load path, ensuring that every pound of pull was directed away from the center of the Earth. Then the sensors registered a sudden drop in tension. This was not a failure of the cables, but the moment the mud suction finally released its grip, the hull began to vibrate as it was pulled through the final few feet of the glacial clay. This was the breakout. 1,100 tons of steel were now suspended in the water column, and the weight stabilized as the vacuum seal was replaced by the natural buoyancy of the flooded compartments. The submarine was no longer a part of the Earth. It was a load being managed by the hydraulic precision of the Smith Semi-1. The cables, which had been vibrating like the strings of a massive instrument, were now steady. Inside the hull, the lack of oxygen had preserved a world that had not seen the sun since 1945. While the exterior was an industrial scene of strained metal and hydraulic fluid, the interior remained a silent vault. Divers would later find letters that were still legible and a stash of wine that remained clear in its bottles. These ephemeral artifacts were protected by the anaerobic conditions of the deep sea. It is a strange contrast between the violence of a maritime lift and the fragile preservation of paper and glass. These items were the silent witnesses to the 48 years of darkness that were now coming to an abrupt end. The first contact with the surface occurred at 4 in the afternoon. As the conning tower of U-534 broke through the waves, the sunlight hit the rusted steel for the first time in nearly half a century. The zinnia camouflage pattern, which had been so vivid in the green light of the deep, appeared muted and ghost-like in the harsh light of the Danish coast. The hull was covered in a layer of fine silt, and the damage from the RAF Liberator was finally visible to the naked eye. The boat looked remarkably intact, a 25-story tall survivor of a war that had been over for decades. But as the water drained from the open hatches and the hull was exposed to the atmosphere, a new and more insidious process was beginning. The oxygen that had been absent for 48 years was now attacking the steel on a molecular level. The salvage was a success, but the preservation of history was now a race against time and chemistry. The moment the hull of U-534 was exposed to the atmosphere, a chemical assault began on a molecular level. For 48 years, the steel had been protected by the low oxygen and high-pressure environment of the Kattegat floor. This state of preservation was now being reversed through a process known as atmospheric oxidation. When long submerged steel is introduced to the open air, The salt remaining in the pores of the metal acts as a catalyst for rapid corrosion. Without immediate intervention, the historical record of the ship would literally dissolve into rust within a few years. This created a preservation crisis that required as much engineering ingenuity as the lift itself. The salvage was not the end of the project, but the beginning of a race to stabilize a 252-foot artifact that was starting to fail under its own weight. The structural reality of a submarine on land is fundamentally different from its reality in the water. In the ocean, the hull is supported by the uniform pressure of the surrounding water column, which provides a natural cradle of buoyancy. On land, the 252-foot hull must support its 1,100 tons of mass through a few specific contact points on a dry cradle. This creates massive internal stress on the longitudinal girders and the pressure hull. Without the support of the water, the long, slender shape of the Type 9 C-40 began to flex and buckle. This is the challenge of sectional integrity. To prevent the inevitable collapse of the entire structure, the engineers arrived at a decision that was both controversial and logically necessary. They decided to cut the submarine into 5 distinct sections. The surgical partition of U-534 was a process of calculated destruction to ensure long-term survival. By cutting the hull into 5 sections, the engineers could manage the load paths more effectively and allow the public to view the internal mechanical systems that had been hidden for decades. Each cut was executed with industrial precision using specialized equipment to slice through the double hull and the reinforced frames. This was a forensic autopsy of a 1945 war machine. It allowed researchers to access the radio room where they recovered a fully intact Enigma machine, a find that provided a direct link to the secret intelligence wars of the Atlantic. The recovery of this device was the intellectual climax of the salvage, proving that the boat was more than just a steel shell. It was a vessel of preserved data. While the Enigma was the most famous find, the internal spaces revealed a meticulous record of German naval engineering. The 5 sections provided a cross-section of the torpedo rooms, the galley, and the engine compartments. This revealed the sheer density of the machinery required to sustain 52 men for months under the surface. The cutting process also confirmed the structural weakness that had been suspected since the initial survey. The corrosion was more advanced in certain areas of the pressure hull than the exterior had suggested. By segmenting the boat, the team was able to treat these areas individually and reinforce the steel from the inside. This preserved the sectional integrity of the artifact and prevented the hull from collapsing under the influence of gravity and atmospheric oxidation. Today, U-534 serves as a definitive case study in professional salvage engineering. It is taught as proof that the recovery of a large military wreck is a balance between hydraulic power and forensic preservation. The salvage did not uncover secret gold or lost Wunderwaffe weapons, but it did recover a preserved human experience of war. The 2,000 condoms, the personal letters, and the acoustic torpedoes remain as evidence of a tactical reality that was frozen in time. The decision to cut the hull is still debated by historians, but from an engineering perspective, it was the only way to arrest the structural decay that began the moment the boat broke the surface of the Kattegat. We did not merely raise a submarine from the seafloor, we extracted a complex mechanical system from the grip of oblivion. U-534 stands as a monument to the logic of the salvage, where the vacuum of the seabed was overcome by the precision of dynamic positioning and hydraulic force. The ocean keeps its secrets through pressure and darkness, but the engineer reveals them through logic and cold steel. The salvage of the last Type 9 C-40 proved that some things should not remain on the seabed forever and that the history of naval warfare is best understood by looking directly into the open sections of a hull that refused to stay buried.